In the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of young Americans were sent to the jungles of Vietnam, where many of them would find their end. But this is the paramount question. Why did the Vietnam War start? How did the United States decide that sending troops 8,000 miles away is necessary? Join us and find out. The Vietnam War has its origins in the broader Indochina Wars of the 1940s and 1950s. At that time, nationalist groups such as the Viet Minh, inspired by Chinese and Soviet communism, fought the colonial rule, first of Japan and then of France. The French Indochina War broke out in 1946 and went on for 8 years, with France's war effort largely funded and supplied by the United States. Finally, after their shattering defeat by the Viet Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May 1954, the French came to the end of their rule in Indochina. The battle urged negotiators at the Geneva Conference to produce the final Geneva Accords in July 1954. As a consequence, the Accords established the 17th parallel as a temporary demarcation line separating the military forces of the French and the Viet Minh. North of the line was the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam. The North was under full control of the Vietnamese Communist Party, led by Ho Chi Minh, with its capital at Hanoi. In the South, the French transferred most of their authority to the state of Vietnam, which had its capital at Saigon and was nominally under the authority of the former Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai. Within 300 days of signing the Accords, a demilitarized zone was to be created by mutual withdrawal of forces north and south of the 17th parallel, and the transfer of any civilians who wished to leave either side was to be completed. Nationwide elections to decide the future of Vietnam, North and South, were to be held in 1956. Accepting the partition of Vietnam as unavoidable, but still pledging to halt the spread of communism in Asia, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower began a program of assistance to South Vietnam. On June 1, 1954, the Saigon military mission was launched, a covert American operation to conduct psychological warfare and paramilitary activities. This marked the beginning of the American intervention in Vietnam. From here on, the American aid would only increase in value and size. At the same time, Viet Minh leaders, confidently expecting political disarray and unrest in the South, retained many of their political operatives and propagandists below the 17th parallel, even as they withdrew their military forces to the north. Ngo Dinh Diem, the newly installed premier of South Vietnam, thus faced opposition not only from the communist regime in the north, but also from the Viet Minh's stay-behind political agents, armed religious sects in the south, and even subversive elements in his own army. Yet Diem had the full support of U.S. military advisors who trained and re-equipped his army along American lines and foiled coup plots by dissident officers. Operatives of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency bought off or intimidated Diem's domestic opposition, and U.S. aid agencies helped him keep his economy afloat, but also to resettle some 900,000 refugees who had fled the communist north. By late 1955, Diem had consolidated his power in the South, defeating the remaining sect forces and arresting communist operatives who had surfaced in considerable numbers to prepare for the anticipated elections. Publicly opposed to the elections, Diem called for a referendum only in the South, and in October 1955, he declared himself President of the Republic of Vietnam. The North, not ready to start a new war and unable to induce its Chinese or Russian allies to act, could do little. Leaders in the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C., were surprised and delighted by Diem's success. American military and economic aid continued to pour into South Vietnam, while American military and police advisors helped train and equip Diem's army and security forces. However, beneath the success of the Diem regime lay fatal problems. Diem was a poor administrator who refused to delegate authority, and he was suspicious of anyone who was not a member of his family. His brother and close confidant, Ngo Dinh Nhu, controlled an extensive system of extortion, payoffs, and lobby through a secret network called the Con Lao, which had clandestine members in all government bureaus and military units, as well as schools, newspapers, and businesses. In the countryside, ambitious programs of social and economic reform were halted, while many local officials and police engaged in extortion, bribery, and theft of government property. Many of these officials were, like Diem himself, Northerners and Roman Catholics. This, along with the rampant corruption, further alienated the South Vietnamese leaders from the local people, especially in the countryside. In 1955, the South Vietnamese Prime Minister launched an unexpected offensive against communist political organizers and propagandists in the countryside. This resulted in the arrest of thousands and in the temporary disorganization of the communists' infrastructure. By 1957, however, the Communists, now called the Viet Cong, had begun a program of terrorism and assassination against government officials and functionaries. The Viet Cong's ranks were soon swelled by many non-communist Vietnamese who had been alienated by the corruption and intimidation of local officials. Beginning in the spring of 1959, armed bands of the Viet Cong were occasionally engaging units of the South Vietnamese Army in regular firefights. By that time, the Vietnamese Communist Party, meeting in Hanoi, adopted a resolution calling for the use of armed force to overthrow the Diem government. Southerners, specially trained in the North as insurgents, were infiltrated back into the South, along with arms and equipment. A new war had begun, one that would initially seem under control, but it would prove to be a ticking time bomb. Despite its American training and weapons, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, usually called the ARVN, was in many ways ill-prepared to meet the insurgency of the Viet Cong. Higher-ranking officers, appointed on the basis of their family connections and political reliability, were often apathetic, incompetent, or corrupt, and sometimes all three. The higher ranks of the army were also thoroughly penetrated by Viet Cong agents, who held positions varying from drivers, clerks, and radio operators to senior headquarters officers. With its heavy American-style equipment, the ARVN was principally a road-bound force not well configured to pursuing Viet Cong units in swamps or jungles. U.S. military advisors responsible for helping to develop and improve the force usually lacked knowledge of the Vietnamese language, and in any case, they routinely spent less than 12 months in the country. At the end of 1960, the Communists in South Vietnam announced the formation of the National Liberation Front, which was designed to serve as the political arm of the Viet Cong and also as a broad-based organization for all those who desired an end to the No Din Diem regime. The front's regular army, usually referred to as the main force by the Americans, was much smaller than Diem's army, but it was only one component of the Viet Cong's so-called People's Liberation Armed Forces. At the base of the Viet Cong were village guerrilla units, made up of part-time combatants who lived at home and worked at their regular occupations during the day. Their function was to persuade or intimidate their neighbors into supporting the National Liberation Front, to protect its political apparatus, and to harass the South Vietnamese government, police, and security forces with booby traps, raids, kidnappings, and murders. The guerrilla forces also served as a recruiting agency and source of manpower for the other echelons of the Viet Cong. Above the guerrillas were the local or regional forces, full-time soldiers organized in platoon or company-sized units who operated within the bounds of a province or region. As members of the guerrilla militia gained experience, some of them were upgraded to the regional or main forces. These forces were better equipped and acted as full-time soldiers. Based in remote jungles, swamps, or mountainous areas, they operated throughout a province in the case of regional forces, or even the whole country in the case of the main force. When necessary, the full-time forces also reinforced guerrilla units for special operations. But why did the United States send troops to Vietnam? Was it really necessary? To answer these questions, it is necessary to understand the underlying reasons. By the middle of 1960, it was obvious that the South Vietnamese army could not cope with the new threat. During the last half of 1959, Viet Cong ambushes and attacks averaged well over 100 a month. In the next year, 2,500 government functionaries, as well as other real and imagined enemies of the Viet Cong, were assassinated. It took some time for the new situation to be recognized in Saigon and Washington. Only after 4 Viet Cong companies had attacked and overrun a South Vietnamese regimental headquarters in January 1960 did Americans in Vietnam begin to plan for increased U.S. aid to Diem. They also began to search for ways to persuade Diem to reform and reorganize his government, a search that would prove useless. To the new administration of President John F. Kennedy, who took office in 1961, Vietnam represented both a challenge and an opportunity. The Viet Cong's armed struggle against Diem seemed to be a prime example of the new Chinese and Soviet strategy of encouraging and aiding wars of national liberation in newly independent nations of Asia and Africa. In other words, helping communist-led insurgencies to overthrow the shaky new governments of emerging nations. Kennedy and some of his close advisors believed that Vietnam presented an opportunity to test the United States' ability to conduct a counterinsurgency against communist subversion and guerrilla warfare. But there was one thing that mattered most for the American leaders of the time, especially in Southeast Asia: the domino theory. It stipulated that the fates of all Southeast Asian countries were closely linked, and that a communist success in one of the countries would necessarily lead to the fatal weakening of the others. However, a successful American effort in Vietnam, in Kennedy's words, the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia, would provide evidence of U.S. determination to meet the challenge of communist expansion in the Third World. While the Kennedy administration faced much more pressing matters, such as the humiliating Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba or the construction of the Berlin Wall, U.S. aid to Vietnam kept flowing in increasing quantities. Most of the South Vietnamese Army's firearms came from the United States, but the corruption was so widespread that large quantities of American rifles, carbines, machine guns, and mortars were simply sold to the Viet Cong. As the situation continued to deteriorate, Kennedy sent 2 key advisors, economist Walt W. Rostow and former Army Chief of Staff Maxwell Taylor, to Vietnam in the fall of 1961 to assess conditions. The two concluded that the South Vietnamese government was losing the war with the Viet Cong and had neither the will nor the ability to turn the tide on its own. They recommended a greatly expanded program of military assistance, including items such as helicopters and armored personnel carriers, and an ambitious plan to place American advisors and technical experts at all levels and in all agencies of the Vietnamese government and military. They also recommended the introduction of a limited number of U.S. combat troops, a measure the Joint Chiefs of Staff had been urging as well. Well aware of the domestic political consequences of losing another country to the communists, Kennedy could see no viable exit from Vietnam, but he also was reluctant to commit combat troops to a war in Southeast Asia. Instead, the administration proceeded with vigor and enthusiasm to carry out the expansive program of aid and guidance proposed in the Rostow-Taylor report. To guide the military effort, the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam was established in Saigon. The number of U.S. military personnel in Vietnam rose from less than 800 throughout the 1950s to about 9,000 by the middle of 1962. Encouraged by its aggressive and confident American advisors, as well as the influx of weapons, the South Vietnamese Army took the offensive against the Viet Cong. But the Viet Cong quickly learned to cope with the ARVN's new array of American weapons. Helicopters proved vulnerable to small arms fire, while armored personnel carriers could be stopped or disoriented if their exposed drivers or machine gunners were hit. The Communists' survival of many military encounters was helped by the fact that the leadership of the South Vietnamese Army was as incompetent, faction-ridden, and poorly trained as it had been in the 1950s. The following is a suggestive example. In January 1963, a Viet Cong battalion was surrounded in the Mekong Delta, south of Saigon. Though outnumbered by South Vietnamese forces, it successfully fought its way out of its encirclement, destroying 5 helicopters and killing about 80 South Vietnamese soldiers and 3 American advisors. By now, some aggressive American newsmen were beginning to report on serious deficiencies in the U.S. advisory and support programs in Vietnam, and some advisors at lower levels were beginning to agree with them. But there was also a large and powerful bureaucracy in Saigon that had a deep stake in ensuring that U.S. programs appeared successful. The U.S. Military Assistance Commander Paul Harkins and U.S. Ambassador Frederick Nolting in particular continued to assure Washington that all was going well. By the summer of 1963, concerns about the Diem government's ability to handle the war grew, as its behavior became increasingly erratic. The South Vietnamese government had a catastrophic way of handling internal dissent, as was seen in the Buddhist strikes. Here, the regime's answer was violence. By this point, many South Vietnamese, including students and professionals, had joined the Buddhist movement. Following government raids on Buddhist pagodas in August, a group of South Vietnamese generals secretly approached the U.S. government to propose a potential coup against Diem, the South Vietnamese prime minister. Though the U.S. response wasn't discouraging, it wasn't until November that the generals felt prepared to act. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese army units took control of Saigon, disarming security forces and occupying the presidential palace. While officially neutral, the U.S. Embassy maintained contact with the dissident generals and didn't intervene as the prime minister and his family were captured and killed by the army. In a curious coincidence, President Kennedy was assassinated only 3 weeks after No Din Diem. Kennedy's approach to Vietnam left his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, with a legacy marked by indecision, partial measures, and a gradual escalation of involvement. While Kennedy embraced Cold War challenges, Johnson prioritized his ambitious domestic legislative agenda. He recognized that foreign policy crisis could undermine his domestic reforms. However, Johnson, like Kennedy, understood the political consequences of allowing another country to fall to communism. He shared the belief of many advisors, including those from the Kennedy era, that Vietnam was a critical test of American credibility and commitment to its allies. Consequently, Johnson was determined to uphold the U.S. commitment to South Vietnam. Acting accordingly, he increased the number of U.S. military personnel from 16,000 at the time of Kennedy's death to 23,000 by the end of 1964. But Johnson did not know that he made a critical mistake, for which he would be remembered as the president who sent American boys to their death in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Nevertheless, while Kennedy had the comforting illusion of progress in Vietnam, manufactured by Harkins and Diem, Johnson faced a starker picture of confusion, disunity, and muddle in Saigon, and of a rapidly growing Viet Cong in the countryside. Also, the removal of the unpopular regime did not bring the expected unity or bolstered war efforts. Instead, a short-lived military junta was followed by a shaky dictatorship under General Nguyen Khan in January 1964. In Hanoi, communist leaders, sensing victory, decided to escalate their military commitment to winning the South. They sent troops and entire units of the North Vietnamese Army southward through Laos along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, bolstered by support from China and the Soviet Union. Amid the turmoil in South Vietnam, the Americans saw striking the North as their only viable option. Small-scale maritime raids and parachute drops of agents had limited success. By the summer of 1964, the Pentagon devised a plan for airstrikes against selected targets in North Vietnam to deter its support for the insurgency in the South. Some of Johnson's advisors suggested seeking broad congressional authority to safeguard U.S. interests in Southeast Asia, but Johnson postponed action until after the 1964 presidential election, wary of the issue's controversy. In August 1964, an unexpected development shifted the course of events. The USS Maddox destroyer was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats while conducting surveillance patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin on August 2nd. The day before, South Vietnamese Navy patrol boats had conducted raids near North Vietnamese islands, possibly leading to the confusion. Despite no damage to the USS Maddox and the North Vietnamese boats being repelled, President Johnson responded by sending a second destroyer, the Turner Joy, and ordering retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases following reports of a second attack on August 4th, despite inconclusive evidence. Johnson sought congressional support for broad authority to deal with future threats in Southeast Asia, leading to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which passed through the House and Senate with overwhelming support on August 7th. Although what many came to see later as Johnson's deceptions, the immediate result of the president's actions was to remove Vietnam as an issue from the election campaign. In November, Johnson was re-elected by a landslide. Between the Tonkin Resolution and the U.S. presidential election, Vietnam's situation deteriorated rapidly. Successive governments in Saigon were short-lived, and even elite South Vietnamese army units struggled against the Viet Cong insurgency. The Communists also targeted U.S. military personnel and bases, escalating tensions. By mid-1964, U.S. advisors advocated for retaliatory actions against North Vietnam to boost South Vietnamese morale and hinder Hanoi's support for the insurgency. Despite warnings from some advisors about further American commitment and domestic political fallout, Johnson prioritized action to address the crisis. In February 1965, the U.S. commenced Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. As the bombing failed to halt communist advances in the South, military leaders advised Johnson to deploy U.S. combat troops. By June 1965, the South Vietnamese Army's collapse was imminent, and advisors recommended immediate troop deployment. In late July, Johnson authorized sending 100,000 troops immediately and another 100,000 in 1966, effectively committing the U.S. to full-scale war in Vietnam. Despite this, there was no economic mobilization, and the National Guard and reserves remained inactive. Also, the Congress did not vote for a declaration of war. This makes Vietnam special in the United States history, as it was an unconstitutional war. So this is how the Vietnam War came to be. This is how American citizens ended up being drafted and shipped half the world away. And in the following minutes, you will see how all this chaos concluded. The period from 1966 onwards saw intense fighting across South Vietnam, as U.S. and South Vietnamese forces conducted large-scale search and destroy missions aimed at rooting out Viet Cong and NVA fighters. The conflict became increasingly brutal, with heavy casualties on both sides and significant destruction of infrastructure. By the end of 1966, the United States had dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than it had dropped on Japan during World War II. In January 1968, the North Vietnamese Army launched a massive offensive across South Vietnam during the Tet holiday. Although the offensive ultimately failed militarily, it had a significant psychological impact, demonstrating the military power of the communist forces and shaking American public confidence in the war effort. Despite escalating military efforts, the U.S. was unable to achieve a decisive victory. Growing domestic opposition to the war, fueled by mounting casualties and the lack of clear progress, led President Richard Nixon to adopt a policy of Vietnamization, gradually transferring responsibility for combat operations to the South Vietnamese while reducing the number of American troops. Finally, in 1973, the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed the Paris Peace Accords, which aimed to establish a ceasefire and pave the way for a political settlement in Vietnam. As part of the agreement, U.S. troops were withdrawn from Vietnam. Nevertheless, despite the ceasefire, fighting continued between North and South Vietnam. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a major offensive, quickly overrunning South Vietnamese defenses. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese troops captured Saigon, marking the end of the Vietnam War and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule.